Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. We are back to another webinar from the Gloucester and Cheltenham branch. It's really good to have you all with us. Today, we're going to have a webinar on immersive virtual reality, and we have with us today Ken Cameron, who is a lecturer in visual computing at the University of Bath. It's really good to have you with us, Ken. I'm pretty sure it's going to be a very good and engaging talk. So Ken, after you, thank you very much again for giving this talk for us today.
Right, well, thank you for inviting me. So I'm going to pull up my slides. There we go. And you can hopefully see me as well. So I'm going to talk about learning in virtual reality. So just click here. There we go. So across the top, what I'm going to do, I'll give you a brief introduction to me, to how basically I got to where I am and why I'm talking about the stuff today. Then I'll look at a bit of background to extending reality, to virtual reality, and why we've got to an interesting point in the development of that technology. Then talk about actually doing training in VR and start to introduce some of the benefits, but really the main part of this is I want to present some examples of work that's been done at the university, not by a research group as such, but actually by a group of students that I've been supervising, both undergraduates and MSc students, and you'll see why it's that particular group of students as I go through the talk, and then I'll round off with some conclusions, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So, as you've already been told, I'm a lecturer in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Bath. I'm actually part of the visual computing group there, and I only became a full-time academic in 2017. So I've only really been doing this sort of lecturer thing for really 5 years. Prior to that, I was in industry for the best part of, what, 25 years or thereabouts, a little longer now. My background is in computer graphics, but also processor architectures, embedded, high performance programming, that sort of thing. So across my career, I've programmed everything from little bit 8-bit microprocessors right up to members of the top 10 supercomputer table, not just programming, but doing a little bit of design along the way. And as part of becoming a lecturer, I've actually got really interested in that topic of learning and how we go about learning, because it was a new thing to me when I started lecturing. As I said, I basically had been in industry for most of my career, up to about 10 years ago. In fact, I came across the email recently because it is almost exactly 10 years ago since I first got involved in teaching. In 2012, I got contacted by a friend at Bristol University who said, we need somebody to teach our graphics course. Part-time basis, it's just a few hours a week for a semester. Come in, give some lectures, set some coursework, set an exam. And it's just for a year until they basically found a replacement for a lecturer that had left. So a couple of weeks later, I found myself on a part-time basis starting to teach this final year graphics unit. And I really enjoyed it, and the students seemed to like it, and it was just meant to be for a year, but the department actually kept me on for a couple more years, again, still just a part-time thing, before they were able to actually bring it back in-house. But in that process, I thought, I really enjoyed it. I want to do that again. But that kind of opportunity doesn't come up that often. So I kept an eye out, I was back in industry doing my work, doing my day job, but kept an eye out looking for another opportunity. And then a couple of years later, so we're now at towards the end of 2016, but I actually started 2017, Bath University needed somebody, a 10-month temporary contract, but it's full-time, completely teaching focused. And the main reason for that was that they had a group of lecturers who were doing teaching, and they wanted to give them an opportunity to focus on getting some research funding in to make their grant applications, but absolutely no chance for an extension, just a temporary 10-month thing. But all of those staff actually turned out to be really successful in their grant applications and bought themselves out of teaching. So my contract was extended and then made permanent. So now I am a full-time member, certainly for the last 5 years, teaching a mixture of computer graphics and also data science. Right? You are probably aware of the huge interest in data science, machine learning. It's another area that I'm interested in, mostly from my high performance computing days. So I'm doing that as well. I am expected by the university to keep pointing out that we're always looking for more data science lecturers. We know everyone else is as well. So here's my little plug for them. But in that process, 5 years, I've become really interested in how to actually teach properly. I suspect, like most people, when you have a job and you're doing it and you want to do it well, you continually try and develop your skills. And I'd had that 3 years of part-time experience starting to do some teaching, and I was essentially just doing it the way that I had seen it done 20 plus years earlier when I was a student, and not really understood how it was supposed to be done. So once it became the full-time job, you want to do it better, you start to read up on it, you learn, you speak to your colleagues, and so on. So as all academics do, you start to develop interests in research, even though I'm not technically doing any research. Virtual reality is one of them, but also the process of learning was the other one that I became interested in. I said I was taken on basically to do teaching, and that is still the situation I'm in, right? My contract is 100% teaching, so I technically don't do any research. I'm not allocated any time to do research. However, I am supervising somewhere between 10 and 15 final year undergraduates and master's students individual projects. So the master's students projects are actually research projects and tend to run over the summer for sort of 3 or so months. The undergraduate projects run across semester 1 and 2, so essentially from October into May. Those are not technically research, they're not research students, they're undergraduate students, but one of the best ways to set up those projects is essentially to set them up as if they were research projects and then allow the students to step back from that if that's too much for them. So I don't get allocated time to do research, but I do effectively have 10 or 15 researchers working for me on lots of little projects. So if I create small enough little projects, I can get that done. And to some extent, that's what I want to talk about in this presentation, is some of the stuff that those students have been doing and how we can start to link those together to form a picture of what's going on. So as I've really become obsessed about this how we learn business. And then the other thing, of course, is just like lots of people, I've been waiting around for virtual reality to come of age. I've seen lots of different versions of it in previous years, so virtuality, things like that. And a bit like the flying cars, it's always promised that, you know, sometime soon we will get it. I think it's finally arrived. I think we do actually now have a viable virtual reality environment. I'm still waiting for my flying car. So of course, what happens is I then start to link those two areas. I think about can we use virtual reality to actually improve learning, and in particular in the form of a lot of traditional type of training activities that we have. So this idea of, and I'm using the term extended reality here to encompass more than just virtual reality, isn't a new thing, right? The earliest sort of example in terms of computer-based stuff, Ivan Sutherland demonstrating augmented reality. So in his setup, the world is the contents of the computer, the graphics of the computer are presented into his view of the real world. And we've gone through quite a few iterations of that. So here's the original setup, the technology of the day. He's got a couple of little projecting screens that project onto half-mirror displays, so he can see the graphics, but he can also see the real world in front of him. And in order to project that in exactly the right place, the headset has to be tracked. And the way that is done is through a complicated mechanical setup above him that by the movement of that, the movement of wires, you can actually track where the headset is looking. So that's augmented reality, where we're taking elements from the computer and putting them into the real world. The area that I tend to focus on is virtual reality, which is effectively the opposite of that. And that's where we're creating an immersive world inside the computer and then bringing the user into that space and allowing them to explore and interact within that world. And the buzzword for that apparently is now metaverse. I don't know if this talk is being transcribed and it picks up keywords or not, but that's probably the one that will get the most hits. And then the other term that you see is mixed, or used to refer to either of them. Most often, it's actually a marketing term effectively used by Microsoft to talk about what's effectively their augmented reality setup. So there's a number of things that we need to make virtual reality work. We need a refresh and updated version of that sword of Damocles system that Ivan Sutherland created. So the first thing we need is a stereoscopic display, one that can actually be updated quickly enough to give us that sense of movement, that sense of presence within the environment. We also need motion tracking, right? So we need to know, at a minimum, we want the roll, pitch, and yaw of the viewer. So we want to be able to track that kind of movement side to side, pitch forward and back, and then the yaw, the turning behavior. So that's a minimum 3 degrees of freedom. And that's the kind of setup you would have if you're doing a video system. So if you've got a 3D video environment where you're just watching a video and you're stuck in one place and you want to be able to look around the whole environment, 3 degrees of freedom are sufficient. If you actually want to move around that space, doing something other than just teleporting from one place to another, or making the world slide around by using some sort of controller, you need the additional 3 degrees of freedom to actually be able to move around in the space, so move around in the X, Y, and Z. So a 6 degree of freedom environment. And depending on your application, 3 might be enough. In other places, you want 6. The other thing that we need is some form of control for interaction, right? We don't just want the computer to feed us information. We want to be able to put feedback into the system to have some level of control over what is happening. And that could be very simple control from just saying effectively a single button, this and this and this. So you can think of it almost like a mouse pointer where you're just pointing at things. Or we may want something far more sophisticated. So we want something that's much more like the sort of game controller type thing, although it doesn't have to be exactly that. It can be a custom control that maps to the environment. And then all of that has to be done with low enough latency that we don't get motion sickness effects. So everybody's used to the idea of motion sickness in things like cars and on boats and so on, where the behavior, that you see doesn't match the behavior you feel. So you can see the world, sorry, you can feel the world moving, but if you're inside a space that's enclosed, you can't actually see it move. And your body gets very upset that what it can see and what it can feel aren't the same. And that gives you the nausea of motion sickness. You can get the opposite effect with virtual reality, where your body knows that you are not moving because you're stuck in one place, but it can see that you're moving around 3D space. Latency matters in that one in terms of if you're moving around and your movement doesn't match, say because there's a delay between when you move and when the display updates, that gives you one form of motion sickness, or one cause of motion sickness. The other one is if you only have a 3-degree of freedom system and you actually try and move through the space where you should have the 6-degree, you can get that same effect because again, you can see that you're moving, but you're not actually moving. There's been a lot of work done to try and overcome these effects. My favorite one is that somebody realized that if you have a fixed frame of reference somewhere, that can actually help alleviate the problem. So you can do things like if you can put somebody inside some system with some environment with windows, and then there's movement outside of the windows, that generates less motion sickness than if you're actually just free in the environment and there's no containing environment. And that containing environment can become incredibly small. And there was some work done a number of years ago where they realized that if they rendered your nose in your field of view, the effect of motion sickness was reduced. That having that little fixed point of reference just on the edge of your vision was enough to actually help with the motion sickness effect. Not completely, but it actually reduced it. I say there's been a number of attempts at this, right? I'm old enough to remember quite a few of them. I think the previous one that probably got most traction was Virtuality, where their systems actually went into a number of arcade venues, gaming systems. But we've never really got to the point where there has been mass uptake of these things. So why have we got that now? Well, I'm going to give most of the credit for this to Oculus. Right? Other people might agree or disagree with me to some extent, but they were certainly the first that were making this leap, that what they realized was all the components that had been developed for mobile phones could be repurposed. The screens that people had created for mobile phones were actually ideally suited, certain versions of them, to making up the stereoscopic display for virtual reality. They had enough resolution, low enough latency, high enough refresh, low enough weight to actually be put into a headset and be practical. And all the inertial sensors that are used in phones, right? So whether it's just to allow you to have a compass or whether to know which way up the phone is in order to decide whether or not you wanted to answer it. So the magnetometers, I can never say that word, and the gyroscopes and so on, all of those forms of tracking could be used to do that set of 3 degrees of freedom to actually track the orientation. And that technology had some real sort of benefits going for it. The first one was because it's used in mobile phones and is therefore incredibly ubiquitous, it's widely available. It's also very low cost, right? It's been developed to go into cheap-ish consumer devices. So it's plentiful, it's low cost. And then something else that's really important is it's also lightweight because it was designed for devices that people are carrying around with them in their pocket all the time. it's been optimized for weight, which if it's something that you're actually going to have to wear on your head all the time, is a real benefit. So we had this point where basically the technology, the hardware, caught up with everybody's ambitions. We had all the components we needed to build that system. And as I say, I think Oculus were one, if not the first, they were one of the major players in actually taking that vision forward. So we've overcome a lot of those problems. We've got the tracking, we've got the latency, we've got a low cost solution. So we're going to be able to have fairly mass take up of it. The interesting thing that goes along with this is that the software is remarkably mature as well. So that the cost of entry into that development environment, as well as the hardware being cheap, the software is cheap and relatively easy to do. And probably the most common approach that people take these days is to work through some of the games engines, and the two big ones are Unity and Unreal Engine. My particular preference, the one I tend to get my students to use, is Unity. That has the nice property that, as well as being a complete environment where you can develop both through a sort of CAD-like interface, but also a scripting interface, if you load the right module in, you basically just have to tick a box that says, and I want this to work in virtual reality. So you just create a 3D application, and instead of it just being on your screen, by ticking the box and making sure you've got the right library available, it will now run on your virtual reality platform or your augmented reality platform. And in terms of cost, so that in terms of the cost of entry into developing that, again, I don't know the exact terms for Unreal, but Unity effectively work on the basis of you can have a free license, you can get all of the features, and if you start to make a certain amount of money, then you have to pay royalties. So again, the overall cost to start working on this, to develop it, has come down to the point where pretty much anyone with the skills can get involved. And we've got a number of players in the space that are producing the kind of hardware that we use. So Oculus, which is now part of Meta, the HTC Vive family, Google Cardboard, which I'll talk about again. Google have another slightly more sophisticated thing than Cardboard, which is Daydream, that also includes a controller. Samsung Gear is not that dissimilar to Daydream. And then also PlayStation VR, where PlayStation have so Sony have adopted a VR setup that is linked to their PlayStation to allow you to do VR games within the PlayStation environment. So I've mentioned that we can use the sensors that were originally intended for phone use, or originally included in the phones, for doing the first 3 degrees of freedom moving. To get that additional approach, there's a number of ways that we can do it. The most common approaches were essentially sort of outside looking in. So the one that I have here as an example, the HTC Vive, the way it worked was you had a couple of things they called lighthouses, which projected a beam of light, infrared light, horizontally and vertically from 2 stations. So it would do a sweep horizontally, sweep vertically from one, then a sweep horizontally, vertically from the other. And from the crossing points of those positions on a sensor, so when those beams swept past a sensor, and having a number of light sensors on each component, you could track the position of those components. So by combining the first 3 degrees of freedom and this additional set of 3 for tracking in position, and actually merging the two together, doing a level of sensor fusion, you could pretty accurately work out where somebody was and where they had their controllers within that environment. This sort of setup was the original sort of room scale approach that people were using, and all the cables and the extra PC and everything else drawn in is fairly representative of the kind of systems that people were using a few years ago. At the other end of the scale, for anyone that's not familiar with it, I suspect most people have seen it, is the Google Cardboard. And if I do that, here's one here. The way it works is you take your phone running the application, you stick it in, and then you have two lenses. And by projecting the two images onto each half of the screen, you've actually got a display. And then the neat thing is it actually comes with a little button. And what that button does is it moves this little panel forward, and that panel effectively taps the screen. So we have a single button controller. So for a couple of quid and your mobile phone, we can produce a complete virtual reality environment. And if you want to, there's actually plastic versions of it that are a little bit more solid and long-lived. A couple of quid more, but yeah. So we've got to the point where you can do complete virtual reality environment where somebody can basically do 3 degrees of freedom moving around for a couple of quid of cardboard plus your mobile phone. Or you can go up to the other extreme of a very high performance PC with a headset that has full 6 degrees of freedom plus tracking. What's really interesting, I think, from a training point of view is that lower end of the Google Cardboard, and then the thing that's effectively in the middle and is sort of gradually or fairly rapidly taking up market share, best typified by the Oculus Quest, which is the all-in-one headset. So it's a completely self-contained unit. It's got the headset that has a screen in it. It also has the computer that actually does all of the tracking and all of the rendering, and it has controllers. The way the Oculus Quest works is actually using inside-out tracking. So the little dots you can see around the edge of that display, the two at the top and the two at the bottom, are actually cameras. And those cameras are wide enough to take a very wide view, and by seeing where points overlap in different cameras, it can actually track where that headset is in space. And by seeing light emitted from the controllers, the headset can also, in the cameras, it can also track where the controllers are. So the controllers, again, have the various inertial sensors in it, accelerometers, gyroscopes, etc. But they also have infrared emitters that basically can be used by the cameras to track where everything is. So we have the technology in place, and yeah, and I should say we're at the point where that's under 300 or around 300 quid, which is an excellent price point to be at. I realize I'm running a bit slower than I should be, but I think I'm reasonably on time. So the technology, I think, is in place now to do some really interesting immersive stuff at a sensible price point, right? We go mass market and make applications that for a couple of quid of cardboard, everybody with a phone could have access to 300 quid would be an all-in-one system. And we can basically discount having to worry about top-end, high quality PCs, thousands of pounds. I mean, those systems exist and they have their uses, and they also do things like eye tracking and so on. But I think for training, they're probably overkill unless there's a very specific use for them. So now I want to talk about how we actually learn, because that will feed into how we might use VR. And there are lots of different ways of thinking about how we learn, and my particular model that I've come across that I think is my favorite is something called constructivism. And what this says is that we don't just learn stuff by trying to remember it, right? So the whole sort of rote learning thing, it can work, but it's not really the best way to learn. But what we actually have is a model of the world. So we have all of our experience builds up to, and this is how we see the world, we interpret the world. And what we're trying to do is integrate any new information and skills into that model. So we're continually looking to just extend our model of the world by integrating that new idea into it. And this has a number of consequences, one of which is it's much easier to learn something if it's a lot like something we already know. Right? So it's much easier to build up our knowledge in steps by continually extending our model than it is to learn something completely alien to what we already know. Right? And you've probably experienced this, right? When you suddenly have to learn something that's just completely unfamiliar, it can be far more of a struggle than learning something that is probably just as complicated, but is a lot like is very familiar to you, because you can take the underpinnings that you have from that thing you already know and use them to help you understand that new thing. There is a classic example that is used when teaching programming to people for the very first time. The original example, I think, comes from the US, so it's referred to as the peanut butter and jelly example, but you can simplify it in the UK and just use a jar of jam and not worry about multiple ingredients. But it's the idea of making a sandwich. So the idea is the lecturer basically starts with a loaf of bread. So there's a loaf of bread in a bag. It's going to be pre-sliced, a jar of jam, a plate, and a knife, and says, okay, I'm the computer. I want you to program me to make a sandwich. So you're going to have to give me instructions to make that sandwich. So we're relying on the knowledge that people have of how you construct a sandwich. So we're not starting from something completely alien. We're starting from the idea of this is how you go through the process of making a sandwich, and we're going to think about how a computer would do the same thing in order to understand how we actually program the computer. So the first instruction that people give the lecturer is put the jam on the bread, and the lecturer very obediently picks up the jar of jam and sticks it on the loaf of bread, and everybody goes, no, 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 that's not what we meant. You need to take the jam out of the jar with the knife and put it on the bread. Okay, fine. Open the jar, knife into the jam, take the jam out of the bread, and put it onto the bag of bread. At which point they go, no, 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 that's not what we mean. You have to take the bread out of the bag first. And what people are realizing is they have to break the problem down into very simple instructions that the computer can follow. So they get to the point where they realize they have to break down this complicated problem of making a sandwich into tiny little individual clear steps, which is exactly what you're doing with programming. So they're building on their knowledge of what they need to do to make a sandwich, and turning that into the understanding of, if you wanted a machine to do it, you have to be very precise and very clear about what all the individual steps are. So they're extending that model. So when we want to learn something that is genuinely completely new to us, we then need to build it up in steps. And where we don't have that existing knowledge, we have to actually create that structure around us. And the term that's used for that is scaffolding. So this is the idea that we can basically take our starting knowledge and fill in some gaps with some additional information to let us build up the support that we need till we get to the final idea that we're actually trying to learn. And the closer we can keep that to people's original idea, the easier those steps become. So if we can start from what we are sure everybody knows, and we can build the scaffolding up in small enough pieces such that we can take everybody with us on that process, we can build up to that final idea in nice little steps. And I mean, I set up coursework in that way where I get them to do tiny little activities, one or the other, and I try and set them up such that their ideas that they are familiar with. So the very first Python programming exercise is to implement playing the game of noughts and crosses, because everybody's familiar with the rules of noughts and crosses. Right? If I tried to get them to create some arbitrary game they'd never heard of before, it would be that much harder. So applying that model, that makes me a constructivismist, not to be confused with a constructionist. Right? And what constructionist theory says is that we learn most effectively when we're actually doing something. Right? So when you're actually designing or physically constructing, when you're using your hands and you're doing something useful, you actually learn better. Right? This is the reason that trainers are so obsessed with Lego. Right? So the reason that the first exercise on any kind of training course that you go on is some kind of team building exercise with Lego, because it's supposed to involve more of your brain in the process. For those of you that are interested in looking at the extremes of this, I strongly suggest looking at something that Lego developed along with others called Serious Play, where instead of just building things that represent things like actual objects, so building a little model car that represents a car, where you actually build metaphors. So you build things that represent ideas, but you are engaging all of your brain in that construction process. But again, it comes back to that, creating this environment where you are doing things you're already familiar with as part of the process of learning. And all of this kind of idea of learning within virtual reality, so I've laid out some ideas of how people learn things, and I suggested that learning by experience and building on your experience rather than just sitting in a classroom and being taught is far more powerful. The use of VR for that is not a new thing. I'm showing a fairly modern flight simulator in this slide, but the earliest one that I can find actually goes back to World War II, where they had problems successfully launching torpedoes off of airplanes to hit ships. And a company that used to do theater lighting, but was basically scratching around for what could we do to help the war effort, got in touch with the Ministry of Defense and what can we do to help, and they created one of the first flight simulators, the torpedo something trainer, I forget the middle word, but the pilot sat in a little cockpit and was surrounded by something that basically looked like a not quite 360 IMAX screen, and projected onto this where the sea and the sky and the ships and the missiles, and it was all controlled. So the pilot basically controlled their aircraft and the world immersed immerse them in this experience. And we're really just building on that, but the technology's updating. And it's easy to see how that kind of skill training approach would map. So flight simulators, we've been doing that for as I say, decades. But it doesn't just have to be hard skills or behavioral skills that you're actually learning. You can actually use this VR approach for soft skills as well. So PricewaterhouseCoopers did an interesting thing with VR where they created VR training environments for diversity and inclusion training. So they created environments where you actually had that immersive experience to learn about diversity and inclusion. And they did a proper full-on experiment with this. So they actually compared it to the classroom-based teaching that they were doing. And what they found that learners were 4 times faster to actually develop the knowledge they were looking to impart. But the other thing was that they were far more confident in those new skills. That their understanding of what they'd learned was that much greater, that they felt more confident they could apply it because the way in which they had learned it mapped more readily, in fact, I think, basically to what they already knew. So it was mapping more easily to their existing model. It was extending their existing model. So they were more confident that they could relate it to the real world. Right, so what that brings me to is what I actually been getting my students to do. So as I say, these projects are all individual projects, so they are from 2/3 to 1/3 of a year part-time for most students, because they've got other things that they are doing at the same time. They're working on their own, their individual projects. They're getting guidance from me, but they're essentially doing all of the work themselves. They are using a mix of virtual reality technologies. So from Google Cardboard through to the Oculus Quest, we have had some stuff done on full PC systems. Given the limited amount of time that they have, they're not usually able to recruit large numbers of experiment participants, so we can't say with high confidence that the results generalize to the population. But what we can say is that we can find similar results or related results in other published work elsewhere where larger experiments have been done, and that we're seeing similar results from different related projects as well. So the first example is a first aid trainer. And I've chosen an image from this that's actually just a screenshot. This is where if it was a live presentation, I would have brought a load of VR gear with me. I would have brought some Oculuses and some headsets and so on. And after the lecture, everybody would get to try it. But unfortunately, we're not going to have that with the online. But you can see we've got 2 views. If you have that on your phone and you put it in the Google Cardboard, then when you look through it, a bit like the old ViewMaster, you can see that immersive world. And as you move the Google Cardboard around, you can see the rest of the world. So this was created using Unity, deployed on the Google Cardboard. So for something as sort of universal as a first aid, a CPR teaching tool, a very low cost entry for the users. Right, you could easily have hundreds, thousands of people using this for very low cost. And the student did a full experiment with this, where what they did was they actually ran a first aid training course in a classroom environment, and then they compared it to the virtual reality classroom environment that they created using the Google Cardboard and Unity. Their virtual version also included a realistic test scene, which is this thing here, where a car had crashed, somebody had been knocked down, needed to be dealt with. And they ran the two experiments, so they actually got people to try using the headset, or a group of people actually in a class. They set both a written exam, so just a short test to see how much of what they'd been taught in either environment they actually remembered. And they also did a questionnaire to evaluate how people felt they had got on with the experience. What we found was that there was actually very little evidence of any difference in the level of skill that participants achieved. So whether they learnt in the virtual classroom, which was set up such that there was a teacher who basically gave you instruction and showed you how everything should be done, and then you had the opportunity to do everything yourself, step by step. So either that in virtual reality or real life, there was very little difference in what people actually were able to learn from that. But everyone that used the VR environment said that they felt more confident that they would be able to use that new skill if they ever needed to. Which comes back to that same result that PricewaterhouseCoopers saw, that creating that more immersive experience where what you learned, you felt like you learned in the real world. Although you learned it in the virtual world, it was so close to a realistic experience that you felt that it wasn't just something you'd read about or been told about in a classroom, it was something you'd experienced, and therefore you would be able to take that experience into the real world and make proper use of it. So that kind of gives us our first big result, and as I say, sort of ties back to the same thing that PricewaterhouseCoopers found, which was that we can actually use a virtual environment that is realistic to some extent to substitute for the real world experience. And one of the great things about that, of course, is that you can do it far more cheaply and safely than you probably could do in the real world. I mean, it is unlikely that a student would be able to set up a crashed car scene for somebody to learn CPR. I mean, I know the emergency services actually have facilities to do that. Out on the edge of Bath, they have the fire service have their training centre where they have a section of motorway where they can run exercises, but that's expensive to set up. They know it's incredibly valuable because they know that creating that realistic experience is far better than a classroom environment, but doing that safely, cheaply has value. A related project that another student did was to create a fire training system. So again, there was the mechanism to actually work through and learn about the different kinds of fire safety measures that were available, the different kinds of fire extinguishers, so whether it's water or foam or CO2, and then choose the right kind of fire extinguisher for the right kind of fire and actually use it correctly. And the setup that they created was that you went through a series of rooms in a building, and there was a fire that developed in each one, and it was different kinds of material, and you had access to a range of fire extinguishers in each room to put these fires out. So you had to choose the right kind of fire extinguisher and use it correctly. That was done using the Oculus Quest, because that actually allowed you to have proper control over the fire extinguisher. So the downside of using the Google Cardboard is because you've essentially just got one button and you can effectively point at something and click, you don't have a lot of control or fidelity of control. But with something like the Oculus Quest, where you have the two hand controllers with multiple buttons, it's much easier to actually do things like pick stuff up and manipulate it. So you can actually pick up a fire extinguisher and then manipulate the nozzle to point it at the right place. So a more expensive setup, I mean, still only 300 quid, but it has the big advantage, of course, that it's much easier and safer to experiment with that than it is to try and get a group of people to all use real fire extinguishers. The usual thing with this is perhaps an instructor might demonstrate some fire extinguishers, but it's unlikely that everyone gets a chance to have a go with all different kinds of fire extinguisher, if they're learning fire safety as part of being a fire marshal in a building. This particular experiment, we didn't get as much experimental evidence as the previous one. This was done in the middle of COVID. This student actually started ahead of getting locked down. So by the time they were ready to do experiments, of course, we weren't actually in a position to run them. And it also wouldn't have been practical, even if we had been able to do that, to compare it to the real thing. But what he was able to do was get feedback from various fire officers, both within the university and elsewhere, that this was a sensible, a useful tool. They could see the benefit of trying to use something like this in their training activity. In addition to those kind of direct training applications that I've had students develop, I've also been looking at some of the other aspects of learning in VR and trying to find setups that we can do to isolate a particular aspect of the use of VR, particularly as it relates to training or undertaking training activities, and just experiment with that one aspect. So try varying the levers around that one particular thing. So an interesting one we did was, everyone is probably familiar with something called Kim's game, and even if you don't recognize the name, you will recognize the activity. So the classic is to have sort of 20 objects. I know that Daniel's involved with the Scouts, and he will have come across this kind of activity many a time. You have 20 objects, you get to see them for a period of time, and then they're taken away from you, and then you have to remember what they all were. So you get a fixed amount of time to remember all the objects. So here's one particular set of objects that a student created. So what they did was that they had a room where they had a table, they had a series of objects. This is one particular set. But what they did is they actually created 3 versions. So in version 1, there was just the table with a set of objects. And when you started the program, the objects appeared on the table. They were there for a period of time. I can't remember if it was 30 seconds or 60 seconds. I think it was 60 seconds. And then they disappeared. And then you took the headset off and you tried to remember all the objects. In version 2, the objects appeared, and then in turn, each one lifted up, spun round, and dropped back down onto the table. And it went through them in sequence. And then all the objects disappeared. And again, you took your headset off and you wrote down all the ones that you could remember. In the last version, and we did this with the Google Daydream, so we actually had a controller. You used the controller like a little laser pointer, and you could point at an object, and when you pointed at the object, it would rise up, spin round, and drop down. So you had some level of control over it. The student actually ran the same 3 experiments as equivalent real-world experiments. So in the first one, you got to see a table of 20 objects. In the second one, you got to see 20 objects, and somebody in a lab coat picked up each object in turn and showed you. And then in version 3, you were presented with a table and you were told you were allowed to handle the objects. So you still had a minute, but you could pick them up and look at them. So when you could only look, the recall was actually a little bit better in VR than real life. But the more interaction we allowed, so the more you were sort of doing something than simply looking at a static scene. So when the object started to move or when you could actually pick the objects up, the recall dropped. We're going to have to do a follow-on experiment to test our hypothesis for why this was the case. What we think is happening is that there was a level of novelty in doing this. So using VR was a novel experience for people. And the more interactive it was, the more novel it was. And what happened was that people got so involved in the experience and the novelty of being able to do things like point at objects and have them move, that they forgot the point of the experiment. They forgot that they were trying to remember the objects. They were so focused on just playing with the objects that they stopped trying to remember them. If that's the case, that's another interesting result. It's a bit of a cautionary result, because what it says is that we have to think about the novelty of VR and whether it's going to be a gain because it might be more engaging. We've seen that in other things where, because it's novel, people are more engaged in the process and that helps, or the novelty actually distracts them from whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, right? They spend so long looking around and playing with the environment that they're not properly undertaking the task that they're supposed to be doing. So the overall effect is reduced. So it's another thing to sort of bear in mind in that process. So the next one that I want to talk about is so I was actually approached by a chemistry lecturer who was having some problem or has problems basically teaching students in the chemistry department to understand how 2D drawings of molecules map to the 3D model of a molecule. So you will have all seen little ball and stick models, and there is a way to draw on paper a representation that tells you about how that shape actually forms. And what they were saying is there some way we could, with computer graphics and or virtual reality, actually help students to understand that relationship between 2D and 3D? They figured there must be a way with computer graphics to replace the sort of ball and stick models in some way. And we started from the beginning on that one, saying we want to work with Google Cardboard because we want this to be something where, in theory, if not in practice, the chemistry department could, at the beginning of the semester, just hand out the Google Cardboards to every student, require them to use their own phones, maybe have a small stack of phones for anyone who doesn't have one, and everyone could use this bit of software on their own time, rather than what's currently happening, which is they all have to turn up at labs and actually work with the ball and stick models. So again, we ended up with another Unity-based application. This one actually, again, goes in sort of two parts, because it has a training mode and then a quiz mode. And in the training mode, it shows you a number of the different features that are represented as both a 2D example, and you can see it in this one here, where there's a little square labeled example that has the 2D drawing, and then it has the 3D molecule. And what unfortunately you don't get to see on the screen here is that actually rotates. And as it rotates, what you see is that the molecule lines up with with that plane, So when you're actually looking at the plane face on rather than edge on as we are at the moment, you start to see more of that shape of the atoms and the little sticks connecting them, representing the bonds, matching up to the diagram. So in the training mode, it's explaining how those different shapes are formed, and it has a number of different ones. And again, you've effectively got a point and click thing, so you can see a back button and a reset button to move around. And then there is a quiz mode in which it basically shows you a molecule, and then it shows you a number of 2D representations, and you have to pick the correct 2D representation to match to the molecule. So it shows you a number of different common molecules that they use for this kind of purpose. So this is something that's sort of ongoing. We need to basically develop it a bit further, and then the aim is eventually to run an experiment with a much larger cohort of chemistry. So effectively take an entire year of chemistry students who are actually supposed to be learning this stuff, and give them access to the app. We can we're at this point where we can see it as a sort of proof of concept. We have the basic software going, and we want to get that as our next step. There is a really interesting thing, and this is probably going to be another project I set as student, is to look at actually exploring it as an augmented reality based one. So you start with a printed page with the 2D design on it, and when you look at it with your phone, the 3D molecule emerges from it. So the molecule can actually leap off the page. There's been a number of other projects that I've done that I'm not going to have time to basically go through the detail, but I kind of want to mention because there's some interesting stuff coming out of it. You don't just have to learn that kind of behavioral type stuff or just pure knowledge. So the chemistry one is very much just about learning what would normally be sort of book work, and the whole sort of learning CPR and a series of activities. There's some really interesting stuff of can you actually transfer motor skills. So something we've been working on is, can you take the skills that you learn from bat and ball type games back and forward between the two environments? Another thing that's of interest is, can we change the level of stress that people feel, and does that have any impact on the learning? And therefore, and should we actually include some level of stress such that when people have to experience something for real, because they've already experienced it with the artificial stress, it's not as stressful? A couple of examples there. We had an escape room one where the idea is essentially the ceiling gradually falls down and gets closer to you if you're not solving the problems quickly enough. And another one was a zombie battle where you're trying to fight off the zombies, and we can vary the rate at which the zombies are appearing in order to, and where they're coming from, to create a more stressful situation, to see whether or not you actually do better or worse in those games depending on the level of stress. Because again, if you're learning a skill where you think people might have to use it in a stressful environment, can we help train for that? And then the other thing is related to that is just how much presence do we actually have to give people for it to be an immersive experience? So to what extent do they actually have to feel can they work with just controllers if that's all they can see? Do they need to be able to see hands? Do those hands need to be connected to a body? Should they be able to look and see their body? To what extent does changing the avatar, their sense of self within that environment, change the sense of presence, and therefore how much immersion there is in that? So, conclusion. we have reached the point where basically virtual reality is cheap, well supported, and actually works this time. It lets you do lots of things that could be too expensive or just too dangerous to do in real life. And as a training tool, what seems to be happening is that immersive experiences actually can both increase retention, but also the confidence in those skills because they relate it far more to the real world than a classroom setting. It can make you more confident that when you needed to use them in the real world, you would be able to. And finally, I'm always looking for ideas for student projects. So if you have some sort of training need or could benefit from the use of VR, do get in touch. No guarantee how it will turn out, because that depends entirely on the student, but you'll probably learn something in the process. And I am about to embark on something called a vertically integrated project. This is a multi-student project that actually runs across multiple departments. So we might end up with computer scientists and geologists and psychologists and business students and chemists and all sorts. They can essentially join in a project at any point. They might be at any stage in their academic career. So they might be first year, they might be final year, they might be PhD, they might be involved for a semester, they might be involved for a couple of years. The big advantage is the projects are ongoing. So instead of the problem we have at the moment where we do these fantastic VR projects and then the student graduates and has no more interest in it, the things that we develop here will be ongoing. So there'll be a far greater support and development for them. VIPs are a relatively new idea. Bath's only been doing them for a couple of years. They're not that widespread in universities in the UK. But yeah, I am starting a VR one this semester. So I believe we have well over a dozen students already signed up and the deadline's not for another week. But again, I'm looking for any ideas or people who potentially have something they think would be worth developing. If you have an idea there, do please get in touch. Right, that is all I want to say. I don't know where I've got on time. A little bit over, but I did get told I would have a bit more time if we needed. So I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ken. It was a really, really good and quite engaging talk. Really, really interesting. Once again, thank you very much for this talk. We have quite a good set of audience, and now anyone wanting to ask a question, you're more than welcome to drop a couple of questions. We have some comments, Ken, from Daniel.
Yeah.
He's saying, indeed, it's a great activity for scouts.
Yeah.
When you mentioned
that's the King's game. I remember those.
We have a question from Tracy. The question is, what's your view on whole class systems where every child in the class has a headset and is led centrally by the teacher?
That's really interesting. I think that will come down to what it is they're trying to achieve. Because there are times when I would really like that kind of system when I'm lecturing. Right there, I teach a lot of graphics, and it would be amazing to actually be able to bring everybody into a three-dimensional graphics world and actually be able to point at things in 3 dimensions, as opposed to what I currently do, which is point at things on screens. I have that problem where I can tell when I'm marking an exam paper how many people work from the 2D slides that the 2D pages of slides, even when it's meant to be 3-dimensional, and the people that turned up at the lectures and actually saw me waving my hands around in 3 dimensions. I can see the difference when I'm marking exams in that. I think it would very much depend on the activity. If it's something where you are creating a whole new environment and everybody is sharing that experience, I think would be incredible value. It's the same, it's a bit like going on a school trip but not having to leave the classroom. But if it's just if it's just three-dimensional for the sake of it, and you could have got away with just doing the same thing, showing some pictures on a whiteboard, not so much. But yeah, I think it depends on the activity. And if it's to replace a field trip, then maybe it has value.
Brilliant, Ken. Very good. Again, if anyone has more questions, feel free to drop in the chat. So we have a question from Zaid. He's from our University of Gloucestershire, and he's asking, would you be available for guest lecturing with the University of Gloucestershire, for which we could reciprocate? We have just started an augmented and virtual reality module this semester, where we would welcome your expertise. It's a good invitation from Zaid as well.
Yeah. Well, my email's at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to get in touch. I'm sure we can sort something out.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ken. Zaid is our course leader for the web development, web design, some of computing technologies course as well. We have another question from Daniel. How important is the quality of rendering, or is it simple cartoon graphics enough?
I think the simple cartoon is sufficient. I showed you the screenshot for the first aid training, and you can see that looks very much like the typical sort of game environment, because it basically was using game assets. So the buildings and the car and everything basically are stuff that would normally show up in a games engine, but people still felt it was sufficiently real that it was of value. So I think as long as it is giving them that sense of immersion, it's sufficient.
That's quite interesting. Thank you, Ken. Again,
It does give me a thought that I've clearly got another experiment I need to run, which is how much the variation in rendering actually has an impact on how immersive people feel it is.
Yeah, that seems a very, very interesting study. Feel free, anyone that has any more questions. In the meantime, we don't have new questions, but I have actually a question for you, Ken, particularly in terms of the final bit where you explain some of the projects your students are working on. I found quite interesting the one about stress and stressing. You give an example for escape room where the ceiling is coming off. I can see the benefits of that, but I also can see the drawbacks and the challenges, particularly through the ethical perspective. What are your thoughts in terms of the ethicality or the ethical aspects of using that, for instance?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's something we've gone round and round on, because we have this thing of one of our ethical tests, and I'm sure you have a similar thing, where you're basically saying, are you putting people in any more danger or stressful situation than they would normally experience in their day-to-day life? So there's a certain sort of oddness of that, in terms of, are we creating an environment where it's like safe stress? It's a bit like a roller coaster. They know that ultimately there is no real danger there, but it feels a little bit stressful. But deep down, they know it is safe. But then, yes, you have to be careful. And one of the things that we have to go through is we have to be very clear what it is we're doing, letting people know what's involved, in order to make sure that we're not picking people who know that they might actually react badly to that, but also to monitor it. So yeah, I think it is a better approach than perhaps trying to do something that would be genuine risk in order to induce stress. And the closest sort of real example I can think of is it's a bit like basically roller coasters, are creating a level of stress and exhilaration, but in a safe way. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are absolutely terrified of roller coasters, and you need to be very careful when dealing with them. So yeah, we have set those up in a way that sort of we have tried to be reasonably safe in terms of the whole sort of notion of a ceiling closing in is stressful, but they also fundamentally know that it's not real. And then the zombie one is very much just, it is a game environment, and effectively we're playing with the level of difficulty in a way that induces stress. But again, in a way that sort of is very easy for people to back off of. But yeah, it's one that the students and I had a lot of discussion about and had to fill in quite a lot of forms to actually get to a sensible point. Does that
Yeah,
answer the question?
yeah. No, I was wondering that. I can see the benefits, but I can also see the challenges, as I mentioned. Thank you very much, Ken. We have another question from Zaid. So, in terms of technologies with Unity, would you consider the built-in AR foundation framework or alternative platforms? Forgive me if I pronounce it, wrongly, such as Vuforia.
Yeah, Vuforia. I haven't actually played myself. I haven't played a lot with the AR stuff, but I did have a student, an MSc student last semester using Vuforia. What they were doing was tracking the labels of packaging in order to give you more nutritional information. So they were basically recognizing labels on packaging to allow you to do comparison. They seem to find that okay, but I said I don't really have a lot of experience of that stuff. Let me know what you find out.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ken. I cannot see any new questions, or I cannot see other questions so far. So I think we can probably, again, thank you very much, Ken, for the presentation. It was a really, really good
You're welcome.
talk. It was really good to have you. Zaid, you have Ken's email address, and anyone wanting to get in touch with Ken, his email address is on the screen right now. The recording for the webinar is also is usually available in our BCS branch website. We would like to thank everyone for this lovely participation. Again, thank you, Ken. Thank you, Daniel, for introducing Ken to us as well. Next month, we're going to have another webinar. So we're going to continue with our monthly webinar, and we'll be sharing all the schedule with all of you at the Gloucester and Cheltenham branch. Ken, thank you very much. And
you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.